Hello, everybody. I hope everything's going well. It's balls cold out here in the nice, cool summer night coolness. Um, yeah, it's pretty cold. It's like 2:30 a.m. out here. Um, so yeah, I guess what we're gonna talk about today is the pathogens. Hold on, let me do some dangling with the YouTubes. Line up everything. Probably could have did all this show a little bit soonish. Boop. Is it even worthwhile even try to get a camera going? Uh, yeah, that's kind of too dark for that. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, let's not even torture myself with that. All right. So yeah, this is coming off of a working theory of mine, which is that when we look at the common thread between mental illness, sin, and human depravity, but also human morality, there seems to be almost like a metabiological system that functions within the body that is tied to the consciousness. And many people have attempted to map it. This isn't so much an attempt to map it, but more so an attempt to ask questions about how it functions. What is the function of the consciousness, and what is the function of our fears, our hopes, our dreams, and our emotional responses to things. So, for the starters, let's just kind of do a premiere on what a pathogen is.
A pathogen is a microorganism that can cause disease. In this video, we are going to discover what they are exactly, how they can spread and cause infection, and how their spread can be reduced or prevented. Pathogens may be viruses, bacteria, protists, or fungi. They are just microorganisms that can cause disease. Bacteria are microscopic. Even the biggest are only 10 micrometers long, which is minuscule. Once bacteria find their way into the body, they release toxins that make us feel ill. Examples of bacteria infections are cholera, typhoid, food poisoning, and gonorrhea. Although bacteria are very small, viruses are much, much smaller again. They are among the smallest organisms we know of. Viruses not only enter your body, but they enter into cells and reproduce inside cells. They reproduce hundreds of thousands of times, and eventually cause the host cell to explode. The virus then passes out through the airwaves, bloodstream, or other route and can spread through populations. Examples of viral infections are the flu, influenza, measles, mumps, the common cold, and AIDS. Of the thousands of species of fungi, a few can cause human diseases. They can cause minor skin conditions all the way up to life-threatening diseases. Some common fungal skin conditions are athlete's foot and ringworm. They are contagious and can pass from person to person through direct contact, or less commonly through contact with common surfaces. There are some opportunistic fungal diseases that can take advantage when the immune system is lowered for other reasons, such as cancer or AIDS. Protists are single-cell organisms. Some protists can contaminate food and cause amoebic dysentery, which is an intestinal infection and results in severe diarrhea. Protist pathogens can also be parasitic. They live in or on other organisms and cause harm. Malaria is an example of a protist pathogen that lives in the blood and is transmitted by mosquitoes. Watch the second part of this video to see how pathogens are spread and how their transmission can be prevented.
So the key thing here is microorganisms. And it gives us four different classifications for microorganisms. But for the sake of looking at this in a metaphysical sense or in a theological sense, what we're trying to discuss here is the interaction between spiritual pathogens and the human meta-immune system. So, when we're talking about the idea of interacting with demons or fallen angels or, you know, messing around with idols, what we're talking about is a meta-organism. This is an organism that exists outside of the natural biomes of this reality. So, when we look at the idea of how these beings affect us, what they're doing is they are trying to manipulate the human being in order to weaken their moral and ideological and um, philosophical schema so that they can then be infected with these illnesses, which can develop into a mental illness, it can develop into a physical illness, it can develop into an emotional illness, um, like PTSD is both a psychological illness, but it's an emotional illness in and of itself. It's a failure to be able to respond properly to uh, stressing stimuli or anxious stimuli. Same thing for like BPD or for autism or ADHD. It's not that there's a demon directly causing these illnesses. So when we try to pray against these things, or even physical illnesses, we're trying to pray against a demon that's not physically interacting with you. Instead, there was a weakening in your metaphysical being that was taken advantage of that allowed this presence to infect you with an illness that you have to get a cure for. And the Bible offers various forms of vaccination that we will look into towards the end of this video. But for the general gist of what we're trying to talk about, look at the idea of microorganisms and take that, abstract it, and put it towards the idea of what other religions would call bad spirits or negative presences or bad air in a sense. So we have these beings that have fallen away from heaven. Now, what was the original purpose of heaven? Well, heaven was created to be all one realm. And in this realm, there was a homeostasis of biological processes by which beings could live and most likely die, because how else could Adam be aware or even Eve be aware of death if there was nothing actually dying? It's more likely that God allowed things to exist for as long as they wished to exist, and then whenever they wanted to stop existing, they could stop existing. But until then, they could exist for as long as they wish. So death was chosen rather than prescribed through the circumstances of the environment and the influences and the choices made by the individual. Instead, it was a direct choice of the individual to continue going on or to not, the will to live. And I think that this is something that's just seen in the rivalry between the physical body and the metaphysical body, which is summarized in how the physical body has biological processes which are meant to keep the body alive, even when the physical, or I mean, not the physical, but the psychological being has given up or lost the will to live. Vice versa, the body can lose the will to live, but the individual powered through psychological brute forcing of the whole body into compliance. It's the same process reversed as well. So we have here a sense of a body that is prone to things like cognitive bias, cognitive dissonance, and if you look into these things from an evolutionary bias, um, as an evolutionary byproduct, then you have to understand that these things evolve as part of a defensive mechanism for the mind against metaphysical or psychological aggressors or of psychological Darwinistic stressors. So the oppression of societies or even the oppression of death for example, would be a stimulation for the individual to have a conscious reaction to adapt to these things through the development of religious faith or through the development of moral obligations through social contracts. All of these things are a byproduct of the metaphysical stress that's placed on a physical being. But that metaphysical stress is translated into physical stress. When the process by which that happens, I think, is the process by which metaphysical disease becomes real, tangible illness in an individual. Um, on a sliding scale, we would say that bacterial infections would just be like being infected with an urge or temptation that has taken root. So you have an addictive behavior, would be like a bacterial or constant festering. It blooms inside the body as the immunity is weakened, but the immunity can usually suppress it. Viral infection would be the taking over of one's thoughts or their emotions and the corruption of those once possibly good or godly instincts, and then the corruption of those towards the negative. The probiotic kind of infections, those are more of the guttural, the instinctual, the corruption of the essences. This is where your soul itself is being led wrong through idolatry, the worship of vain things and vanity. The fungal infection would be more akin to what we would call possession, the infection or the direct manipulation or parasitic infestation of a host by a entity, whether it is demonic and or fallen. It doesn't really matter. The effects tend to be towards the production of death and destruction in the life of the individual or the spreading of chaos into the world through this individual suffering through these illnesses. Um, all of these can cause many different illnesses, both physical, emotional, and mental, but also, especially and usually stemming from the spiritual. Now, this is not to say that all illnesses are caused by meta-organisms, but all infections or microorganisms can be used by meta-organisms, and all organisms can be indwelt by meta-organisms and their ability by being beings of energy to be able to dwell within any being that relies off of the process of energy to function and drive its day-to-day functionalities. Oh, Lord, help me be able to explain this to people. So, the best way to test this theory out was through the same methods by which vaccinations were created, through the direct injection of these pathogens into a host. Lacking any better host, I could only do observations at first of other people to understand how sin and their lives affected them. Now, when I personally started taking on this research a couple years back, I've been able to amass a decent amount of experience in the consumption of these pathogenic meta-organisms, insofar as allowing them to at times affect and force my immune system to go into haywire or to have to react. This has allowed me to understand both the flesh but also the spiritual being. It's not a foolproof process. It's definitely not refined through a peer review process that I could really vet. But in terms of personal observation, I would say that it's come to give me a better shape of or a better idea of what it's like to suffer from sin from the world point of view of somebody who is able to see what sin does to the human body. So insofar as my observations are, is that sin leads to death, but insofar as its effect on the human being, it depends on the environment and the immunity of the host. Now, each human being has a different tolerance to meta-organisms. So, Christians have a different tolerance level than non-Christians. And by Christians, I'm lumping in all people of Judeo-Christian background, including atheists and agnostics who came from a Christian background. If you have once been indoctrinated and or introduced into the system of baptism or ritualized prayer towards Christ, then there's a different interaction between your immune system and others. And it also is changed by whether or not you fall away, is something I've noticed as well. And so all of these different influences can set up the predisposition of the individual, both physically and metaphysically, to be interacted with by meta-organisms. For a lot of individuals, all of us have some sort of meta-organism um, affecting our life. Now, we're not getting into the idea of the meta-organisms that are positive for the spiritual being or the physical being. These would be the angels that the Lord sends over you, which again means angel means messenger. So it just means something that God has sent for the purposes of God. So an angel that's sent to bring good tidings of health, or to bring recovery, or to bring peace of mind. These are meta-organisms that are used as antibodies or an immune system defense against these negative meta-organisms that come from the external environment. But while most people could have the positive meta-organisms already inside of them, a natural immune defense, and this is what being strong in the faith and being sanctified would allow you to be able to achieve for most people, and for most people living a sinner's life, or even living a saved life while still in sin, striving against sin. Uh, the crown of thorns situation that Paul was talking about. Meta-organisms can still come against the body, still infect the body, and still lead to the destruction of the physical organs and of the metaphysical connections between the body and the spiritual world. So, an individual can suffer through spiritual blindness for the infection of meta-organisms. But again, it's not necessarily the meta-organisms that do it. You can get rid of the meta-organism and still be infected by the chemical compounds, the toxins that they leave behind, or you can be infected by the other carriers, like in the case of, a parasitic creature infecting you, um, like pornography or drug addiction. You would have leftovers of this original infestation. It would leave these meta-organisms within you that have to be then purged. And they may not be physically demonic or even angelic in origin. They may be thought forms which originate from within the individual or within the collective consciousness of men, groups of people, and it's a psychonic energy personified, given form to then act against the tangible world. More often than not, what we think are demons are actually thought forms that have taken on the natural form in which they do, which is to consume that which is around them. Thought forms are created more often than not as side personalities or side identities, and it's symptomatic, or I would say it has a correlation to schizophrenia, but I wouldn't say that there's a causation. One is not necessarily related to the other, but the same meta-organisms can cause the same symptoms in individuals, which is the fracturing of their spiritual being and their physical being, causing a disruption by which new personas can be infiltrated or established within the individual, whether by the meta-organisms themselves or by the human being themselves. So in the case of drug addiction, where it leads to the breakdown of the human mind, the onset of schizophrenic hallucinations, you're having an interaction by which a meta-organism can then install personas by which it can then dwell within. Now, why do meta-organisms do this? Well, it's the same process by which pathogens do the same thing. In fact, I think this is why diseases of pestilence oftentimes are where these things are drawn to, alongside other creatures that deal with pestilence or have the ability to spread pestilence, because it's the quickest way to use energy to break down the energy of a host to then recompile them. And again, these beings survive off the recompiling of information and of energy. So if they exist by destroying and consuming the life force and the being and energy and spiritual forces of others, then what they're trying to do is sabotage the physical being of the individual to then expose the spiritual being to the final parasitic consumption, which is the reincarnation cycle that most people believe goes on. As I've explained in other videos, reincarnation is actually deception by the enemy. It is the process by which they consume human souls and then they repurpose those human souls, memories, and experiences to then deceive other human beings into allowing these spirits into their lives so that they can siphon off their psychotic energy. Now, once they've finished siphoning off this person's energy, they can then kill the individual and steal their identity, their memories, and their experiences, and continue to spread through those means. Just like how memes can spread and become personified by just as many communities that take them on, these beings can also become defined and spread themselves and reproduce, spreading themselves across both time and space and reality. Because they cannot cross time and space in themselves by being beings of energy, they are trapped to the energy dynamics and limitations of this dimension of reality. So, as this universe is limited in how energy can expand and contract, be exploded out and then fade out, so too are these beings limited to this realm. They can interact, but they are not all in control of it. They exist outside time and space, and so there is a certain element of them that can interact between different branches of what we would consider alternate realities or of parallel universes. But insofar as actually having a full presence in any universe, once they lose their physical bodies, they are purely energy beings who have to then meander their way into this world or into any other universe by which they wish to interact with or exert themselves upon. So yeah, let's go and get into the immune response.
Thanks to Brilliant for supporting this episode of SciShow. Go to brilliant.org/scishow to start their courses in math, science, and computer science for all skill levels. Viruses are arguably the most notorious parasites on Earth, and they can be kind of creepy to think about since they don't just make you sick, they actually hijack your cells to make more of themselves. We can try to kill them with chemicals or UV light or design vaccines to thwart them, but even then, they often evolve to evade our efforts. Except, all of that's kind of wrong, or at least really weird to say because most scientists don't consider viruses to be living things. How do you kill something that's not alive? Or how can a non-living thing evolve? This isn't just a philosophical question or a quirk of language. In fact, whether viruses should be considered alive is an incredibly stubborn problem in biology, and when we try to finally pin an answer to it, things get difficult, if not a bit absurd. But maybe that's okay because life might just be a bit absurd, and if we really want to try to find every living thing on this planet or figure out if any life exists elsewhere, we'll need to confront that absurdity. Part of the problem is that there's no single agreed-upon definition of life. One scientific analysis found more than 100 examples of people trying to come up with a definition. Potential definitions generally tend to focus on hallmarks of life, like whether the thing in question is able to maintain some sort of metabolism, a stable system of chemical reactions that provides energy. Being able to reproduce on their own is important too, as well as the ability to evolve via natural selection. And a lot of the time, these hallmarks exclude viruses from being placed on the tree of life. But it turns out that excluding viruses for lacking these features is a bit problematic as well. There are quite a few things we consider more alive than viruses, even though they also lack some of those essential traits of living things. Like, certain kinds of bacteria can go inert or form spores. They're not able to grow and divide until they wake up. Still, we don't consider them dead. And there are things like Wolbachia, which are bacteria found inside the cells of many insects. They can't really survive on their own, not for long anyway, but they still count as alive, and viruses don't. You might say, aha, the difference is that Wolbachia, or these inert spores, still have that all-important cellular machinery. They've still got the genetic code for the machinery that turns genes into proteins, for instance. But so do some viruses, apparently. Mimi-viruses were originally discovered in 1992, and they are huge. They're large enough to be seen with a regular microscope. They are, in fact, so large that researchers initially thought they were bacteria. It wasn't until 2003 that we realized they were actually viruses. And they're not only big, they're weird. Their genomes are complex with over 900 genes. Previously, it was thought that viruses topped out around 200. More importantly, they seem to have some of the construction machinery needed to build the next generation of viruses. And these parts are functional. They directly participate in the process of making proteins. Don't get me wrong, they don't have everything they need to make baby Mimi-viruses. They still can't reproduce on their own, but neither can Wolbachia. And the presence of these proteins may suggest that they could, way back when. Speaking of things that were once alive and independent, what do we do with mitochondria? They're specialized structures found in animals, plants, and other eukaryotic cells that look like little bacteria and produce the cell's energetic currency. They even have their own ribosomes and DNA. Still, they're not considered alive, even though they once were. They came into being because some bacteria set up shop permanently inside a cell, which, come to think of it, isn't all that different from those Wolbachia. You might think it's easy then. Viruses and mitochondria are alive. But if we're being generous with the life label, should we also extend it to much smaller parasites? Like narnoviruses. They're so small that they don't even have a capsid, which is the name for the virus's protective coating. They're basically just a bit of protein and genetic material that floats around until it infects a fungus. And we can go even simpler. There are things like plasmids or viroids, which are just infectious genes, no proteins at all. There's even spooky stuff at the genome level. A certain type of virus called a retrovirus can also integrate its genes into a host's genome and then emerge again years later. And there are so-called selfish segments of DNA that can essentially cut themselves out of the genome, replicate, and then stitch themselves back in at new locations. Should we still talk about them as just a quirk of genetics, or are they more like viruses that just happen to live in our genomes? Anyways, the point is that whatever definition of life you use, when you try to actually apply it to the real world, it becomes hard to draw a precise line between alive and not, or chemistry and biology. Now, there are definitely people who still think viruses shouldn't be included in the tree of life and that conventional definitions work well enough, but others disagree, especially because delving into the complexity here can help us see viruses with new eyes and maybe even rethink our approach to the science of life. Before we get too deep into some of the alternative concepts here, we should note a few things. One, we're going to purposefully give a high-level overview of these ideas, so we're not going to hit every nuance. If you want to dive deeper, we'll link to some key papers in the description. Two, we're not saying these ideas are universally accepted, just that they're examples of how scientists are rethinking the definition of life. And lastly, while defining life based on what exists on one planet is bound to miss things, it's not a useless exercise. Different definitions can lead to different questions and different ways of understanding the world. And that's why some scientists have tried to rethink what a virus is and even proposed entirely new definitions for life. One interesting idea is that the little seed of illness version of a virus, what's called a virion, isn't really a virus, no more than a sperm is a person. Instead, it's only part of the virus life cycle. And viruses can be considered living cellular organisms once they've hijacked the internal machinery of cells. Inside a cell, a virus can reproduce, metabolize, and evolve. In this phase, it's what one researcher has dubbed the virocell. Strangely, this can happen in coexistence with the old cell. We know of viruses that don't destroy their host, just kind of hang out. And since both organisms could use the same cellular machinery to build things and reproduce, this means one cell could belong to two organisms at the same time. The distinction, then, between viruses and regular cells would be whether they have genes that code for ribosomes or for capsid coats. This doesn't totally give us clarity on what is and isn't alive, though, like those weird replicating proteins aren't included. For that, one of the main scientists behind this idea proposed that any individual thing that participates in a living process, from plasmids to elephants, should count as alive, a purposefully broad definition. Others think that the very idea of putting the label of life on things is somewhat silly. What you're really asking is, where can you draw the line? But everything we know of suggests that there are no lines, just fuzziness. In a 2016 paper, two researchers proposed something a bit radical. They suggested that all biological entities, from humans down to viruses and even extending to those weird edge cases like plasmids, are built of replicons, or units of reproduction. Any of these that are at least partly autonomous get dubbed replicators. And to count as that, there must be some trigger, some signal that can cause the replicator to reproduce independent of its environment. So a gene embedded in a huge chromosome might not count because it can't replicate independently of the rest of the chromosome, but a virus would. We can still draw some distinctions, like whether a replicator can produce its own energy and resources as a cell does, or whether it parasitizes others like a virus. Some borderline situations may still exist within those, but notably this does away with the question of whether viruses are alive, because it groups everything we've discussed so far under one header, the replicators. Also, because replicators can cooperate with each other, they can build into yet larger replicators. Genes build cells, which build organisms. We can go from jumping gene and mitochondria to elephant without breaking the system, and it allows us to talk about the selfish end of things, like those weird self-replicating genes, without needing to draw too many lines. A self-copying gene is just a replicator in the larger elephant replicator group. In the end, when you consider these newer ideas and traditional viewpoints, viruses might be dead, or they might be alive, or they might be a process or event more than a thing, or they might be part of a spectrum of living things. We've certainly got options. As for why this matters, well, it's important to note that viruses are not just an unfortunate quirk of biology, they play an important role in ecosystems. For example, viruses are a key part of the ocean's nutrient cycle because they prey on and break apart bacteria and phytoplankton. They're also big players in evolution. By moving genes from one species to another, or by causing mutations, they've shaped the genomes of all living things. We may have viruses to thank for our placentas, for example. It's even been suggested that the nucleus in our cells may have started as a virus that invaded some ancestral nucleus-free cell way back when. But more broadly, this matters because different definitions can affect the way we think and ask questions. The way we frame things can influence the kinds of questions we ask. For instance, if you're buying a house as an investment, you might have some questions about property taxes. On the other hand, if you're buying it as a home for you and your future family, you might ask about the school district or the neighborhood culture. Similarly, exploring different definitions of viruses could help us ask better questions about early life on Earth and what role viruses were playing back then. If we automatically accept the idea that viruses are a process cells go through, then by that reasoning, cells must have already existed. On the other hand, if viruses are just replicators, maybe some proto-viruses did exist before cells, in which case, what were they doing? And was it important? Thinking about definitions can also help us search for life elsewhere in the universe. For example, a few papers have pointed to NASA's 1976 Viking mission to Mars. During that mission, in between all the geology and chemistry that needed to be done, scientists had enough room for just one experiment to look for life. After all, you can only fit so many instruments on a probe. The one that got selected looked for metabolic activity in the soil and got inconclusive results. It made sense at the time. Metabolism is one of the traditional hallmarks of life, but would a different definition have resulted in a different test getting put on the probe? And if so, you just have to wonder, what kind of results might that test have gotten? I love questions like that really make you think about how the world works. And that's the kind of curiosity and deep thinking that today's sponsor, Brilliant, aims to inspire. You see, Brilliant offers dozens of STEM courses so you can learn or relearn every
So yeah, that basically gives us an idea that life and what we determine on life is very, very, very different from what we were taught in textbooks. We're not quite certain scientifically yet what it is that defines life, but what we do know is that life is that which replicates self. So, in a lot of ways, I think that it's funny because science is always trailing behind, and if science was truly as advanced as it should be, and if we really knew all the answers, I think it would confirm exactly what the Bible is trying to tell us ahead of time. But that's neither here nor there. If we think about the human being, the spiritual body, as being the same as the physical body, one and the same, what are the plasma and the blood? What is the organs? What are the bones of the spiritual body? This is what we're going to be exploring over the next course of my videos because honestly, this is all that's been on my mind over the last few months, and I'm realizing that I can't keep researching this stuff. This is killing me. I mean, ugh. You can't keep testing out different sins like this. Wrath and lust and sloth and greed. All those things, they weigh on the soul and tax the body a lot. Try to research it, to try to observe it, to even take part in it. It's just too much. I'm done. I'm done. I'm going back home. As far as being back home spiritually means to me, it means that a lot of my research into the more crazier aspects of the world, I'm done. I've found enough answers. Instead, I want to come back home and just tell stories about what I've seen, what I've heard. And so, this is not going to be too much longer because honestly, we're starting to get to about an hour. Oh, well, actually, no, I guess it's, yeah, we're getting about 40 minutes left. So, yeah, we're going to end it pretty soon. But the general gist of these videos is kind of introducing a premiere on what it means to view the body biblically. Because your body isn't just the physical or just the spiritual. To make it either or all or nothing is the wrong way of looking at things. Instead, they are part of the same. Your flesh and your spiritual body are intertwined, and you are the nexus point. Your consciousness is the nexus point, the meeting point where you, in a lot of ways, are trapped having to feed. So a lot of the things that we're going to be getting into over the next couple videos will be flushing out the idea of what these spiritual pathogens are, which means we're going to explore the seven deadly sins. Dun dun dun. Next element that we're going to explore is the building of the spiritual body, which is where the Ten Commandments come into play. And we're going to talk about how the Ten Commandments play a part in building your spiritual skeleton. They're not the building blocks of a whole being, but they are enough to give your body a structure and to give the blood form. And then we're going to discuss what the blood is for the spiritual body, and that would be your spiritual self, your soul. Your soul is tied to your blood, but it's also tied to your spiritual self as well, your spiritual body. And it is the flowing life force by which your spiritual body nourishes itself and shares nutrients between the different organs that work within the spiritual body. Oh Lord, please help me with finishing this part. So you have that aspect of the body that is at play. Another element as well is sorry, that distracted me. This is the hardest part. So yeah, we're going to be going into the idea of how the Ten Commandments build the structure of the spiritual body. We're going to talk about how the soul is the blood of the spiritual body. We're going to talk about how the organs work in the spiritual body, how these are built off of your works and your prayer and the new things that you've placed in yourself to replace the old broken parts of your physical body and your physical um, consciousness, aspects of your consciousness, your memories, your emotions, and things like that, and your reactions. Um, from there, we're going to go and discuss how the human being, who we are right now, how it's the building blocks of who we're truly supposed to be. We're going to discuss how Adam and Eve are not the same human beings as we are, but they are the original human beings. We're going to discuss the idea of the de-evolution of mankind into the Homo sapiens species. We're going to talk about how the line of Noah were hybrids and how that links into this. And so these are going to be things that we bring up in different videos over the course of however long that I take to make them. Hopefully by the end of this, though, we will have an idea of what the spiritual and physical body is really, and we'll be able to navigate that much more better. Um, then we'll start getting into the idea of what each individual pathogen does to the human body, like what it is that lust does to the human body, how it changes the brain, how it can actually cause physiological damage to a human being if they indulge on their lust too much. How if you indulge on your greed too much, it will actually lead to psychological changes, and how it can lead to you making decisions that will affect your health or your interactions with your family, etc., etc. Um, then we're going to go and talk about the idea of how the Lord buffs up your immunity, how the Holy Spirit acts kind of like a mitochondria, but also like many other different aspects of how the biological environment reinforces us and helps our body fight off these diseases. So in a lot of ways, when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, it is trying to jumpstart the metamorphosis of the human body, which is the part that I was finding the hardest to explain, which is that when Christ comes back, we are to be transformed in an instant. Now, in insects, when you see them in their larval state, a lot of insects have something called imageal disc. Imageal disc allow the entirety of the adult, fully reproductively viable form of the creature to be stored within the larval form. And what happens is when they pupate, they actually dissolve. The entirety of the caterpillar dissolves, and it technically just dies while not dying. And in a way, it disintegrates into the ether of the pupal womb world, which is the biome that they exist within. And within that voidal state, this underworld, in a lot of senses, because a lot of these insects bury themselves underground, so you can liken it to also being buried underground. Or some of them do also go up into trees, which would be akin to climbing the vine of Christ and then being in Abraham's bosom to be remade. Either way you wish to look at it, the imageal disc is a vital aspect of what creates the final form. And when we look at angels, they have many different forms, they have many different shapes, and they can also transform. I think that when Christ says their bodies will be even more than the angels, that will be even higher than the angels, he means it in the sense that the physical body, this body that breaks, dies, and can be wounded and murdered, it is the imageal disc of the spiritual adult. So the spiritual body is attached within, harbored within the full body of the physical person. And the physical person is the imageal disc of the spiritual being that you're going to be, the physio-spiritual being that you're going to be when Christ builds us up again. And so when we're rebuilt by Christ, we will have a new form that will be completely us. Your body will be transformed into something more than what it is now, but not something that isn't you. So everything that is going on with your physical body, everything that's going on with your mind and your emotions, all of those are the beginning building blocks of what your spiritual self is going to look like. And this is why it's important for us to become sanctified, because it refines and reduces the imperfections that will arise when these imageal discs are used to rebuild us as the perfect form that we're in. And it will allow us to be more us at the end of the rebuilding. So anyways, as the witching hour approaches, I'm going to go and enter into a time of prayer. I hope that you guys are staying blessed and keep frosty. Love y'all. And watch out for the wolves out there, shepherds.